Hi, welcome to the webinar about securing REST APIs with OAuth 2.0. Today, you are going to see ways to secure RESTful APIs over HTTP. We will talk a little bit about OAuth basics and its authorization code grant flow in particular, and you will see a demo of a sample application written in Spring. My name is Sylwester Gryzio. I'm a solution architect at Kainos. In software architecture, I have spent around 6 years. My favorite activities are cycling, volleyball, swimming. I also like traveling. I'm a happy parent of 2 kids. And if you would like to contact me, please do via LinkedIn or my blog. So what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface, which is a thing that sits between 2 applications and allows them to talk to each other. So as an example, each time you are using an application like Facebook to send an instant message or check the weather on your phone, you are using an API. And here is an example of that, or an illustration. Facebook would usually call Facebook API, and that has access to the internal storage of the data somewhere in Facebook. So the APIs can be divided based on their architectural styles. The most common one is the REST or RESTful, which stands for Representational State Transfer. And this type of API is using a stateless protocol to transfer the data. It can use various types of data like JSON or XML. And the most common protocol for that is HTTP. Then another one is Remote Procedure Call, still very popular, with an example of SOAP messages, and events with an example of CQRS. Today, we would like to focus on RESTful APIs over HTTP. So how we can actually protect resources that are delivered with HTTP protocol. The YANA specification gives us around 10 options. However, we would like to use OAuth. And you can see there are references to 2 OAuths. The latter one is OAuth 1.0, which is the old one, and we would like to focus on the newer, which is referenced as a bearer, which is a mean to get access to the resources using OAuth 2.0. So OAuth 2.0 by definition stands for authorization framework. It is an authorization framework, and it enables a third party, whether an application or a service, to access data stored on a different server or provided by a different service. And OAuth is not an authentication framework by definition. So if we would like to add the authentication layer on top of OAuth, we can, for example, use OpenID Connect, which we'll see some examples of today as well. OAuth 2 is using bearer tokens to provide access to the resources. So any party in possession of that bearer token, which is like a passport, so that someone can, when someone has the bearer token, they can, by providing that token to the resource server, to the server that holds the data, to gain access to this data. That is why the bearer tokens has to be protected from disclosure, both in storage and in transport. There are 2 types of bearer tokens. We can use JSON Web Token notation for this. So the JSON Web Token contains encoded and signed set of claims about the caller, which means that the server that holds the data, when receiving that token, can just decode it and it will know what kind of permissions the caller has. And because they are signed, the signature somehow has to be validated. And this is usually done with the issuer public key, the issuer being the authorization server. And how the server, the resource server can do it is by using something called JSON Web Key, which is again a JavaScript object notation structure that represents a cryptographic key. There are also opaque tokens. They are lightweight, short string. However, they are not carrying any particular information about the caller. They are more like ID that can be exchanged for user information with the authorization server. Again, those tokens have to be protected at rest and in transit. So you have heard few elements, few names of the elements of OAuth. So we are talking about access tokens and refresh tokens. Access tokens are short-lived tokens that gives us access to the data. And refresh tokens usually live for a longer while, and they can be used to renew access tokens without having to re-authenticate. Resource owner is someone who owns the data, and the client is usually an application that would like to access this data on behalf of the resource owner. Resource server, again, is the server that stores this data securely. Authorization server is something that can authorize and most likely authenticate the resource owner. And an authorization grant is a concept whereby resource owner grants the permission to the client to access the data stored on a resource server on their behalf. Here you can see some abstract flow of OAuth authorization. So the resource owner, when they would like to access the data via some kind of a client, this client would then ask the authorization server to obtain access token. The authorization server, of course, has to contact the resource owner to authenticate them, potentially get the permission for the client. Once everything is okay, the authorization server will issue an access token, and then the client will use it to get the data from resource server and present it back to the owner. So there are various ways to obtain the authorization, but we would like to focus on the authorization code grant and understand it a little bit better. So the user agent will be our user person. Client application, it can be a Facebook or maybe some kind of a portal used at the hospital. Authorization server, something that can authenticate and authorize the user, and resource server, something that holds the data. So the user requests a resource, some kind of data. The client application then sends something called authentication code request to the authorization server. The server, of course, has to somehow authenticate and authorize the user, so they would probably display login page. Once the user authenticates themselves, the authorization server then sends back to the application something that we call authorization code. Then the application has to exchange that code for access token. However, they will also present or they will have to also authenticate itself. So the way to do it is to present alongside the code also something called client ID and client secret. Once the authorization server validates all of this data, they can issue access token. And the client application can then use this access token to get data from the resource server. Of course, resource server will also validate that token, but if everything is okay, they will present this data back to the application, and the user can access this data. So for our demo, I would like to build a small API for a company, let's call it well-known company, and their secure store. This API will be written in Spring Boot, and we would like to protect it with OAuth 2.0. So here's the illustration of the scenario. We don't have any application on purpose because I would like to show you how to obtain access token, and we'll do it manually. So we will obtain the authorization code first, then we will obtain access token from Keycloak, and finally we will present that token to get access from resource server. So in order to convert your Spring Boot application to a resource server, you can use something like Spring Boot Starter OAuth to resource server library. And then for your minimal configuration in the application YAML file, just provide the issuer URI, which is the path to your authorization server. And here you can see an example of the Web Security Configurer Adapter extension, where you can define which paths are accessible and they don't require any authorization, or you can say you can define some specific permissions required to access specific paths. Like here, for example, in order to access orders, someone would have to have read orders permission and employees read employees permission. Of course, you also have to say that you are going to use JWT as the access token. Okay, let's go to the demo. So here I have the API. This API provides two endpoints, orders and employees, and they are protected. So if I would like to access it via browser, I would get 401, which means this is a restricted area. I have a Keycloak authorization server with a client defined here specifically for the well-known store. And it also has the client ID and secret authentication scheme. You can see the secret being defined here. There are two scopes, as you have seen, read employees and read orders. So read employees are assigned to boss only. So boss can only see their employees. However, orders in the store can be seen by both roles, boss and employee. And we have three users, Bruce Wayne, Sylwester, Gryzio, and Tony Stark. Bruce Wayne is an employee. Sylwester has no roles. And Tony Stark is a boss. So now I have the application running. You can see that I have used the Spring Boot Starter OAuth 2 resource server library. I use the minimal configuration. And here again, I'm just saying that orders and employees require specific permissions or scopes. And I also have a URL that I will use to get my authorization code back from the server because I need somehow to get it. So the callback controller only gives me the code basically that I receive from the authorization server, and the controllers for the employee and orders are just a basic REST API. Okay, so let's start. I have a script that will help me a little bit with this task. So call token endpoint. So with the authorization code grant flow, I first have to call authorization and so-called authorization endpoint of the authorization server. I have to provide it with a response type, which is code, the client ID, which will be the well-known store, and something called redirect URI, where the authorization server can provide the code back. So for me, it's the callback code Keycloak, and I also provide some scopes. So I will do it now. Once I get the code, I will call that script, and then we will call something called the token endpoint of the authorization server and exchange it using my client ID and client secret and the code provided to get the access token that I will then store locally on the file. so I can use it afterwards to get my data. Okay, so let's go to the private window. And first, I would like to use my account so that you can see that I have no permissions and the server will not allow me to access any of the URLs. So here, right now, I have logged in with my authorization server. The authorization server sent to me the code that I can now exchange for the access token using my client ID and client secret that I store securely on my laptop. So let's see how this access token actually looks like. You can use something like jwt.io webpage where you can decode the access token, which is basically the JWT bearer token. You can see that Sylwester has no roles here, and the only scopes that they have are the standard OpenID or OAuth scopes. And if I now use that to call orders, you can see that the caller has an insufficient scope. And let's see how that call looks like. So I'm just using get request to the well-known /orders, and I'm sending the authorization header with the access token as a bearer token. And I'm just saying that I'm requesting the application JSON response. And the same if I would like to call the employees endpoint, I'm saying I'm getting an insufficient scope response. So let's log in as an employee. So I'm going to the private window. So you remember that Bruce Wayne was an employee. I'm getting the authorization code from the server, and I'm exchanging that for access token using that code and my client ID and secret. Let's see if this is the correct access token. Okay, yes, this is the Bruce Wayne, and you can see it has the employee role and it has read orders scope. So if I now try to call this API with this access token to get the employees, okay, insufficient scope, that's correct. And if I call orders, all should be fine. And I'm getting the data from the server, which is fine. So finally, let's log in as boss and see if we can access everything. So boss was Tony Stark. Again, exchanging the code, client ID and secret with my script. And now let's try calling orders. That's fine. And calling employees. That's also fine. Let's just very quickly see if there is no cheating involved. Yeah, Tony Stark. Yeah, he has read employees and read orders scopes. So everything works as expected. Okay. So thank you very much for watching. If you would like to contact me, again, please use my LinkedIn account or my blog. And if you would like to know a little bit more about Kainos or find out about our recent vacancies, please go to kainos.com. Thanks for watching.